The storm had passed, but the manor still seemed to tremble from its memory. Mark Mercer stepped out of the carriage and felt the heavy Virginia air press against his lungs, wet, metallic, and tinged with the unmistakable scent of rotting wood. The Dandridge estate rose before him like a monument pulled forward from another century, its columns cracked, its shutters trembling in the lingering wind. Yet even in ruin, it clung to a sense of pride, as if decay itself dared not approach without permission. Workers swarmed the grounds, hammering loose boards, dragging fallen branches, muttering curses under their breath. But what struck Mark most was the way they avoided looking at the northwest wing, the part hit hardest by the storm. Every pair of eyes flickered toward it only long enough to betray unease. Some made the sign of the cross. Others pretended not to notice it at all. Inside the manor, the corridors felt colder than the storm outside. The walls were thick with portraits of stern men and pale women, all wearing expressions that hovered between judgment and warning. Mark walked beneath their gazes, guided by a maid who never spoke and whose candle shook in her hand. When he reached the damaged wing, he was greeted by the estate's matriarch, Mrs. Lucille Dandridge, an elderly woman with eyes sharp enough to slice through pretense. She explained the situation briskly. The storm had torn through the roof, exposing part of the attic and collapsing a section of the ceiling on the floor below. She wanted a full assessment for insurance and restoration, but she did not step over the threshold of the ruined room. She gestured instead, motioning for Mark to proceed alone. As Mark entered, dust swirled like pale smoke around him. He noticed the collapsed beams first, then the strange hole left behind in the wall, an opening torn not by wind but by time. Something lay beyond it, a space that should not have existed. He raised the lantern. Light spilled across a small room tucked behind the wallboards, concealed so thoroughly that no blueprint had ever mentioned it. And yet, there it was, a child's bedroom, perfectly preserved, untouched by decay. His breath caught. A tiny bed with a faded quilt, wooden toys arranged with a child's careful precision, a shelf of books, their spines innocent and bright, a pair of small boots placed neatly beside a miniature rocking chair. It was as though the boy had simply stepped out for supper and never returned. Mark stepped inside, drawn not by curiosity but by something deeper, an intuition that the room was not merely forgotten, but intentionally hidden. His fingers brushed across a wooden soldier. The paint was chipped, but the letters carved crudely into its base were unmistakable. Nathaniel. He felt the temperature drop. A prickling sensation pressed against the back of his neck, the way one feels when stepping into a church after everyone has left, when silence becomes a presence of its own. Behind him, the floor creaked. Mark turned sharply, but the doorway remained empty. Only his lantern swayed, its flame bending as though pushed by an unseen hand. He forced himself to focus. He examined the nightstand, the books, the folded clothes. The air in the room smelled faintly of lavender, impossibly fresh for a chamber sealed decades ago. It unsettled him more than any sign of decay would have. On the wall above the bed hung a framed drawing. A child's hand had sketched a house, this house, with a single figure standing in one of the windows. The figure was small, almost shapeless, but the eyes were large, dark, and unmistakably sad. Mark stepped closer. Beneath the drawing, a faint line of text appeared, written in the shaky hand of a child. "I hear you in the storm." A shiver ran down his arms. From somewhere within the walls, a soft sound echoed, like a distant tapping, faint but deliberate, as if something small was knocking to be let out. Mark slowly lowered the lantern, heart pounding with a mixture of dread and fascination. For the first time since he had entered the estate, he felt the manor watching him. And deeper still, somewhere behind the plaster and beams, something seemed to stir, as though awakening to the sound of his breath. For the rest of the morning, Mark carried the sensation of that hidden room like a weight beneath his ribs. He had taken his notes, sketched the layout, documented every irregularity, yet none of it explained why the room existed or why it felt so alive. As he walked down the main hall, he sensed the silence stretching behind him, as though the walls were reluctant to let him leave. The Dandridge library was dim, its curtains drawn despite the midday sun. Rows of tall walnut shelves pressed in around a long mahogany table. Sitting at the far end was Henry Dandridge, the last surviving son of the once influential family. He greeted Mark with a politeness so smooth it felt practiced rather than sincere. Henry's hands, though immaculately gloved, trembled slightly as he poured tea. "So you've inspected the damage," Henry said, voice crisp but brittle. "My mother tells me you found something unexpected." Mark hesitated. "A room, a small one. It appears to have been sealed off decades ago." Henry's spoon clinked sharply against his cup. A flicker of something, fear or irritation, crossed his face. "That part of the manor has always been unstable," Henry said quickly. "Old walls settle in peculiar ways." Mark waited for further explanation. None came. Instead, Henry changed the subject, steering the conversation back to insurance forms and restoration estimates. But his gaze drifted constantly toward the door, as if afraid someone might overhear. The moment Mark stepped outside, he exhaled deeply. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and cedar. He needed answers, ones the family clearly had no intention of giving. A pair of field hands were repairing the outer foundation. Mark approached them, careful not to sound intrusive. "Long day," he said gently. The older of the two men, a black worker named Thomas, paused mid-hammer. His eyes were tired but sharp. The younger man near him stiffened as though silently warning him not to speak. "You're the inspector," Thomas said. "Word travels fast round here." Mark nodded. "Tell me, did you know anything about a boy's room being sealed inside the manor?" A long silence followed. Thomas's jaw tightened. The younger man stepped away, muttering that he had chores inside. Finally, Thomas lowered his hammer. "Folks don't talk about that," he said softly. "But some of us remember. Or at least, we remember the stories." "What stories?" Thomas's eyes darted toward the manor, checking the windows. "The boy was called Nathaniel," he whispered. "Sickly child. Quiet. Some said he had nightmares so bad they made the walls shake. Other nights he was so silent you'd think he weren't breathing at all." Mark felt the cold wind rise again, though the sky was clear. "His family said he died." Thomas continued. "Fever. Quick and cruel, they said. But none of us saw a funeral. No carriage, no preacher, not even a grave marker." Mark's throat tightened. "So you think he didn't die?" Thomas hesitated. I think that house swallows things. And sometimes it don't spit 'em back out." A rustle came from the hedges. Both men turned sharply, but it was only the wind pushing through the leaves. Still, Thomas's expression told Mark that he was not alone in feeling something unseen watching them. Mark spent the afternoon searching the county archives. Dusty ledgers, brittle records, stacks of yellowed newspaper sheets, yet nothing mentioned Nathaniel's death. No obituary, no mention of illness. The boy existed until he suddenly didn't. That absence was louder than any written account. When Mark returned to the manor, the halls felt narrower. The lights seemed dimmer, though no one had touched the lamps. He made his way back toward the hidden room, driven by a sense of urgency he could not explain. Inside, the air felt different. Still lavender, but now mixed with something metallic, like old blood or rust. Mark's lantern flickered as he crossed the threshold. He noticed something he had not seen before. One of the toys, a small wooden horse, lay overturned on the floor. He was certain he hadn't left it that way. As he crouched to inspect it, the lantern dimmed again. The shadows deepened along the far wall, gathering like a pooling darkness. Mark straightened slowly. Behind the tiny bed, faintly illuminated by the failing lantern light, was a new scratch. Fresh, long, and unmistakably shaped like a child's small fingernails dragging downward. The room had been sealed for 20 years, and yet something inside it had moved. Mark barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the scratches behind the small bed. Fresh, deliberate, impossible. The manor groaned under the weight of the wind, boards shifting like restless ribs. He woke more than once with the sensation that someone was standing beside his door. By dawn, his decision was made. Whatever the Dandridge family was hiding, it reached far deeper than a forgotten room. He walked through the morning fog toward the breakfast hall, the sound of his boots softened by the thick carpeted corridors. Mrs. Lucille Dandridge was already seated at the head of the long table, her posture rigid, her expression locked in a mask of dignified restraint. A silver teapot steamed before her untouched. "You seem troubled, Mr. Mercer," she said without looking up. "The manor can unsettle those unfamiliar with its temperament." Mark's fingers tightened around the back of a chair. "There are things in the damaged wing that require explanation. Structural instability requires repair," she replied coolly. "Nothing more." Mark took a breath. "Mrs. Dandridge, did Nathaniel truly die of fever?" The teapot's handle shuddered with a sharp metallic ping. Lucille's eyes rose to meet his, calm but with a depth that felt dangerous. "You were hired to assess walls and beams," she said. "Not graves." Before he could press further, Henry entered the room, face pale, gloves missing, hair disheveled as if he hadn't slept at all. He murmured an excuse and quickly guided Mark out into the hallway. "Mark," Henry whispered urgently, "you must stop asking about the boy. This family has endured enough rumors." "What happened to him?" Mark demanded. Henry swallowed. His eyes glistened, not with grief, but with fear. Some truths do not belong to the living anymore. Before Mark could respond, footsteps approached. Henry stiffened, then hurried away, leaving Mark alone with a new, sharper understanding. He was not merely investigating structural damage. He was treading across wounds the family refused to let heal. Mark left the manor grounds briefly, walking the old dirt road toward the nearest cluster of houses. He had arranged to meet a former servant, an elderly woman named Eunice Harper, who had worked in the estate during Nathaniel's childhood. Her home was small and weather-beaten, but her eyes, cloudy with age, were sharp with memory. "I knew that boy," she said as Mark sat at her kitchen table. "Nathaniel was quiet but not sickly like they claimed. No, he was kept hidden. Too much, if you ask me." "Why hidden?" Mark asked. Eunice's gaze fell to her hands. "Because he wasn't like the others. He heard things, felt things. The walls bothered him. He said they whispered when the storms came." A chill crawled up Mark's spine. "One night," she continued, voice trembling slightly, "I heard him crying. I went to check on him, but Mr. Dandridge stopped me at the stairs, said the boy needed to be alone. I never heard him cry again after that." Mark leaned forward. "Did you ever see him after?" "Only once," Eunice whispered. "Late at night. He was at the end of the hall, standing very still, staring into the wall like he saw something inside it." She paused, breath unsteady. "Next morning they said he'd died." Mark felt the room's air tighten. "But there was no funeral?" "No," she said. "Just silence." And then the door to his room was sealed. Nails, boards, cement, as if they feared the boy might walk out. Mark's heartbeat thumped in his ears. Eunice grabbed his wrist suddenly, her grip unexpectedly strong. "If that room is open again, be careful. Some spirits don't rest because they wouldn't let them die properly." When Mark returned to the manor, the atmosphere felt heavier, as though the house itself sensed his new knowledge. He moved through the hallways with a renewed purpose, each step echoing in the stillness. He reached the hidden child's room again. The door creaked open with a soft moan. This time the lavender scent was gone. The air was cold, sharp, almost wet. The toys no longer sat exactly where he'd left them. A book on the shelf had shifted forward. The small boots were angled toward the doorway, as though someone or something had stood there waiting. Mark stepped closer to the bed and noticed something beneath the edge of the quilt. A torn piece of paper. He pulled it free. It was a page ripped from a child's diary, written in a shaky hand. "They said I must stay here. They said the storms will keep me quiet." But the storms talked back. A faint knock sounded behind him. Mark turned, slowly, but the hallway outside the room was empty. Only the lingering echo suggested that something had been there, and had slipped away just before he looked. The sun barely pushed through the clouds the next morning, leaving the manor draped in a pallid gray that made every window pane seem like a watchful eye. Mark felt the weight of the house more acutely now, not just its age, but its history pressing outward, as though the very structure strained to contain what it had witnessed. He returned to the hidden room once more, determined to understand why the air felt wrong, why the toys had shifted, and why the scratches behind the bed continued to haunt him. But today he wasn't alone. Footsteps approached behind him. Slow, measured, deliberate. Henry Dandridge appeared in the doorway, his posture rigid, his face drawn thin by sleeplessness. "You shouldn't be in here," Henry murmured, his voice cracking. "My mother. She'll be furious if she knows." Mark held up the torn diary page. Is this why she's afraid? Because Nathaniel wrote things no child should have known? Henry's eyes fell to the page. He exhaled sharply, as if the air itself weighed too much. There were problems with Nathaniel. He heard noises no one else heard. He said the storm spoke to him. My parents thought it was imagination at first, then illness. But he insisted the house whispered things he repeated. "What kind of things?" Mark asked. Henry's jaw tightened. Secrets. Family matters he had no way of hearing. Things said behind closed doors, accusations, confessions. His hands shook. They said the boy was a danger to himself, to us. Mark stepped closer. Danger? Or embarrassment? Henry's silence was answer enough. For a moment the two men stood in the dim stillness of the small room, surrounded by toys meant to comfort a child who had never been allowed to grow. A faint draft moved through the cracks, cold enough to raise the hairs on Mark's arms. "Did he die here?" Mark asked. Henry's breath hitched. "I don't know. Truly. One night the hallway outside this wing filled with shouting. Then silence. The next morning they told me Nathaniel had died in his sleep. They kept his door sealed after that. No one was allowed inside. Not even me. But you heard something," Mark said softly. "Didn't you?" Henry's eyes glistened. For years. Scratching. Soft crying. Always during storms. He backed away, voice trembling. I was told it was just the wind. He fled the room before Mark could respond. Mark spent the afternoon searching deeper through the manor, unused hallways, forgotten closets, spaces where dust gathered thick as snowfall. He needed context, something tangible to link the boy's disappearance to the family's panic. In a locked chest in the attic, he found it. Old letters tied with ribbon, their edges browned with time. Correspondence between Mr. Dandridge and a physician from Richmond. The letters grew increasingly frantic. The boy speaks of things he has not seen. He describes conversations he could not have heard. During the storm, he screamed that the walls were echoing. My wife thinks he brings misfortune upon the house. If confinement is the only way to restore peace, then confinement must be considered. The final letter held only one sentence. Seal the room once it is done. Mark's stomach tightened. Once it is done. The phrasing hovered between ambiguity and confession. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. Another storm was approaching. As evening fell, Mark returned to the manor with the letters hidden beneath his coat. He walked toward the damaged wing, determined to gather physical proof. Anything to show Nathaniel had not simply died quietly as the family claimed. The wind groaned through the eaves as he re-entered the hidden room. Shadows trembled along the walls. The air buzzed faintly with electricity. On the desk sat a new object, a small metal key. Mark froze. He hadn't seen it there before. He lifted it carefully. The key was rusty, cold, and engraved with a number, 17. He scanned the room. No drawer matched the lock, no cabinet bore a similar marking. But down the hallway, there was a door he hadn't explored. Warped, locked, and half hidden behind an armoire. Mark stepped into the corridor, lantern held high. The house shifted as he walked, the floorboards groaning as though speaking in a language beneath hearing. He reached the door marked 17 and slid the key into the ancient lock. It fit perfectly. With a slow, grinding click, the door opened. The smell hit him first, dampness mixed with something older, something like grief pressed into wood. Inside was a narrow chamber with a single chair, a small blanket, and chains bolted to the wall. Mark's pulse froze. This was not a room for a sick child. It was a room for keeping someone hidden. Lightning flashed, illuminating the chamber and revealing a faint outline scratched into the wall. A small figure drawn again and again, each one more frantic than the last. Then, behind Mark, the door creaked, gently beginning to close on its own. And from deep within the manor, somewhere in the walls, a child's soft voice whispered, too faint to understand but unmistakably calling for someone. The storm struck the manor with a violence that felt personal, as if the skies themselves had been waiting to unleash their fury upon the Dandridge estate. Rain hammered the windows, the wind twisted around the chimneys like a voice taking form, and thunder crawled through the walls with a low, hungry growl. Mark stood inside the narrow chamber behind door 17, the chains rattling softly as the house trembled. The scratched figures on the walls circled him like ghosts, frozen mid-scream. Lightning illuminated the cramped space again, revealing new scratches he hadn't noticed before, short, desperate gouges clustering near the floor. A child had knelt there, begging, fighting, waiting. Mark stepped backward, unable to breathe. "Nathaniel," he whispered, not as a question but as an acknowledgement. The door slammed behind him. He lunged for it, but the handle resisted, old metal fused by moisture and age. The lantern flickered wildly, desperate shadows flailing across the walls. Somewhere beyond the chamber, deep within the beams, the house groaned with a sound almost indistinguishable from a sob. Mark steadied his breath. "I'm not here to hurt you," he murmured into the darkness. "I want to know the truth." The lantern flame steadied. A cold breeze passed by his shoulder, inside a room with no windows. Mark turned and saw, for the first time, what lay tucked behind the chair. A small wooden box, no larger than a loaf of bread, its surface carved with initials ND. Dust lay thick on it, untouched by recent hands. But the lid was open. Inside, water from the storm had splashed onto brittle pages of a diary, the same handwriting as the torn notes he had found earlier. Mark lifted one carefully. "They say the storms will calm me. They are wrong. The storms want me to hear. Mother cries when she thinks I sleep. Father speaks of shame more than love. They say I must stay in the small room. They say the house will help me forget." Mark's chest tightened. The boy had been locked away, not for illness but to silence what he knew, what he heard. Another page trembled in his hand. "The walls are waking." Thunder cracked directly above the chamber. Dust rained down in thin streams, and the old chains rattled violently as though struck by invisible hands. Mark stumbled into the hallway, the door finally giving way under the weight of the storm's pressure. The manor shuddered around him, lights flickering along the corridor as if the entire house were breathing in frantic gasps. He hurried toward the hidden bedroom, the room where Nathaniel had once slept, cried, whispered into the walls. The door swung open with a sharp metallic moan. The lavender scent was gone again. The quilt was pulled back, and on the small pillow lay something Mark had never seen before. A lock of light brown hair, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Lightning flashed. The ribbon fluttered slightly, though no breeze touched it. Mark swallowed hard. "Nathaniel," he called softly. "Where did they take you that night?" The floorboards creaked behind him. He froze. Slowly, he turned. In the far corner of the room, near the shadowed wall, stood Henry Dandridge. His face was colorless, his eyes wide in the lantern's glow. "You shouldn't be here," Henry whispered, voice shaking. This room remembers everything." Mark stepped forward. "You knew. You heard him. You must have heard him for years." Henry pressed his hands to his ears like a frightened child. "They told me it was the wind. They made me believe it. But last night, during the storm, I heard him again, clearer than ever." "What did he say?" Mark asked. Henry trembled, swallowing back a sob. "He said the house is breaking, and when it finally breaks, the truth will come out with it." Thunder shook the floor. A long crack formed along the ceiling, spreading like a jagged branch. Dust rained down again, and a low groan resonated through the beams. Mark grabbed Henry's arm. "We need to leave the room, now." But Henry shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on something behind Mark, a point in the darkness. "He's still here." The lantern flickered, the flame thinning to a blue-white glow. A whisper brushed past Mark's ear, faint, childlike, trembling. Not a word, a breath, a presence. The wall shuddered violently, and one of the toys rolled across the floor, stopping at Mark's feet. The wooden soldier, the one carved with Nathaniel's name, stood upright, as though placed deliberately. Mark felt the air shift, tightening like the inhale before a scream. Something in the house was waking fully now, and it was not finished. If this story gripped you, don't forget to comment your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and leave a like so we can bring more hidden American tragedies to light. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive.